When you think of Harry VIII's offspring, you likely imagine the merciless Bloody Mary or the radiant Elizabeth I. However, there was another child whose short rule unveiled a darkness that might have unsettled even his infamous father. Eddie VI, the young monarch who ascended to the throne at the age of 9, evolved from an apparently harmless boy into one of England's most authoritarian leaders. His end was so twisted it would leave a lasting shadow over the Tudor lineage. The tale you are about to learn goes far beyond a sickly child dying prematurely. It is a story of how absolute power corrupts completely, even when held by a mere child. What you will uncover about Eddie's last days will challenge everything you believed about the Tudor heritage. The year was 1537 when Harry VIII finally obtained what he had longed for desperately, a legitimate male successor. Eddie's birth was greeted with celebrations throughout England as the resolution to years of dynastic insecurity. Yet his arrival came with a grave sacrifice, since his mother Jane Seymour passed away just 12 days after childbirth, leaving the infant prince motherless. This loss made him even more precious to his increasingly suspicious father. From the very beginning, Eddie was not regarded as an ordinary child, but as England's future savior. He was constantly surrounded by guards, tutors, and courtiers who reminded him of his divine purpose. This separation from a normal childhood experience was destined to be the very first step toward his future. This was the beginning of creating a ruler unlike his sisters Mary and Elizabeth, who both faced their father's anger and rejection. Eddie VI experienced only admiration and praise. Harry VIII, perhaps feeling remorse over how he treated his daughters, lavished his son with attention and affection that almost seemed like worship. The young prince received the finest tutors money could afford, yet these were not ordinary instructors. They were radical Protestant theologians handpicked to shape Eddie VI into the ideal Protestant monarch. From the age of 6, Eddie VI studied not only Latin and Greek, but also detailed theological works describing the evils of Catholicism and emphasizing the divine right of Protestant kings to hold absolute power. The education arranged by Harry VIII resembled indoctrination more than traditional learning. Eddie VI's main tutor, John Chase, was an exceptionally learned man, but also a religious fanatic who filled the child's mind with visions of England as a New Jerusalem cleansed of Catholic impurity. Every lesson, whether about history, philosophy, or governance, was viewed through the prism of Protestant supremacy and royal absolutism. By the time Eddie VI reached 8 years old, he could deliver intricate theological arguments justifying why Catholics deserved death, and why opposing his future sovereignty would equate to defying God himself. What made Eddie VI's upbringing especially perilous was this blend of intellectual depth with fanatical zeal. Experiencing total emotional solitude, he could engage in theological discussions with university scholars. He had never interacted with other children or known typical human connections. His only companions were adults who regarded him with admiration, shaping a boy familiar with intricate political ideas, but lacking an understanding of human compassion or the significance of individual existence. This harmful blend of exceptional intellect and emotional immaturity would influence every part of his future rule. In the autumn of 1547, England came under the rule of a 9-year-old boy raised to believe he was God's chosen instrument on earth. Eddie VI took the throne after his father Harry VIII passed away, inheriting not only a crown, but also a nation fractured by religious conflict. The young monarch had been educated by the most extreme Protestant mentors his father could find. men who filled his mind with ideals of religious purity and unquestioned power. Unlike his older sisters Mary and Elizabeth, who had faced their father's anger directly, Eddie VI was protected, praised, and told from the beginning that he was destined for greatness. This mix of divine right and childish arrogance would result in tragedy for thousands of his people. The England Eddie VI inherited was a tinderbox of religious strife. His father had severed ties with Rome and created the Church of England. Yet the nation remained sharply divided among Catholics, moderate Protestants, and other factions. Radical reformers dominated Eddie VI's Regency Council, led by his uncle Edward Simonds, the Duke of Somerset. At first, the Duke appeared to promise balanced rule. However, the young monarch had his own vision for governing England. From his initial council sessions, Edward showed a strange mix of childish petulance and cold calculation. He would interrupt seasoned advisors to lecture them on Protestant beliefs. What amazed witnesses at the time was how rapidly the 9-year-old king began asserting control. Within weeks of his coronation, Edward personally reviewed death sentences and displayed a disturbing eagerness to order executions of those he considered heretics. Records from the court during this time reveal a boy who treated life and death decisions like intellectual challenges, discussing theological reasons for various punishments with the same cold detachment as he would Latin grammar. Observers noted that Edward often smiled when signing execution orders, seemingly proud of his cleverness in finding biblical justification for each case. The early months of this young ruler's reign were marked by what courtiers quietly called religious tantrums, violent outbursts whenever anyone suggested a softer stance on religious matters. Edward had absorbed his tutor's teachings so deeply that he truly believed any compromise with Catholic customs was a direct betrayal of Christ. One of his advisors recommended permitting certain Catholic nobles to maintain private worship, but Edward allegedly hurled his inkwell at the man, shouting, "God will punish England for such weakness." At first, these events were brushed off as childish antics, yet they actually exposed the emergence of a truly dangerous religious zealot. Perhaps the most alarming aspect was Edward's apparent disinterest in ordinary childhood activities. While other 9-year-olds were occupied with toys, Edward devoted his spare moments to studying accounts of the Spanish Inquisition, meticulously recording interrogation methods. His personal attendants mentioned discovering sketches in his room illustrating various torture techniques, each marked with Edward's observations on their efficiency in extracting confessions from heretics. Instead of learning to ride horses like a typical boy, he focused on mastering the most effective ways to crush both body and soul in service of his Protestant vision. What rendered Edward especially threatening was the blend of fanatic religious devotion and monarchic power. As his advisors schemed around him, the young king eagerly absorbed every lesson about the divine right of kings with frightening dedication. He maintained detailed diaries chronicling his reign, and these writings reveal a child who found morbid fascination in descriptions of executions, religious oppression, and the anguish of those he labeled heretics. By the age of 10, Edward was personally crafting sermons that were preached throughout churches in England. These messages demanded the total eradication of Catholic influence and warned of divine retribution for anyone who showed kindness towards heretics. The young monarch's harshness extended beyond religious issues. Eddie VI exhibited a vengeful nature that even surprised the experienced courtiers who had served his ruthless father. When attendants displeased him, Eddie planned cruel punishments that appeared aimed more at shaming than correcting mistakes. One unfortunate page who spilled wine on Eddie's documents was compelled to remain standing in the courtyard for several hours while courtiers hurled decayed food at him, all under the explicit orders of the 11-year-old king. Eddie observed these degradations with clear satisfaction, often noting the victim's reactions as if he were performing scientific studies. The journal entries of the boy king from this time expose a mind growing more and more detached from common human feelings. Eddie recorded the pain of others with the same cold objectivity he used to report the weather, treating details of suffering and fear as mere points of interest rather than misfortunes. When a kitchen maid died after being whipped on Eddie's command for supposedly saying Catholic prayers, the only remark he ever made was to note that the punishment was more successful than expected, since it prevented further mistakes from the subject. Eddie's behavior reflected a chilling blend of cruelty and detached observation rarely seen in someone so young. Harry VIII's treatment of his own family revealed perhaps the clearest sign of his developing sociopathic traits, despite being raised alongside his sisters in early childhood. Eddie VI showed no genuine warmth towards Mary or Elizabeth after taking the throne. Instead, he perceived them through the same religious framework he used to judge all his subjects. Mary was seen as a perilous Catholic who needed to be contained or removed, while Elizabeth appeared as a possible ally whose Protestant leanings made her somewhat more tolerable. For Eddie VI, family ties were merely strategic moves in a political game. This shift grew even more evident when Eddie VI's uncle John Chase tried to gain favor with him through gifts and praise. Rather than responding to kindness, Eddie VI viewed John's actions as manipulative attempts and answered with cold pragmatism. When John was arrested for treason, Eddie VI not only backed the execution but reportedly observed from his window as the once benevolent uncle was led to the scaffold. Witnesses said the young king displayed no feeling as the blade fell, instead jotting down observations in his journal about which execution methods were most efficient. As Eddie VI approached his 12th birthday, his authoritarian nature escalated sharply. The boy, who had seemed fragile and scholarly before, began exerting direct authority over governmental decisions, often overruling his advisors without hesitation. As he sensed leniency creeping into his reforms, his Protestant measures grew increasingly harsh, with compulsory church attendance enforced through extensive networks of informants and harsh consequences for any divergence from the sanctioned beliefs. Harry VIII personally created a system of religious surveillance that could rival the Spanish Inquisition, urging neighbors to monitor one another and even motivating children to report their parents' religious offenses. His fixation on control stretched into every corner of English religious life. Eddie VI issued meticulous rules governing not only public worship, but private prayers, specifying how his people should pray, what they must believe, and even how they ought to conceive of God. Breaching these rules was treated as treason against both the monarchy and the divine, with punishments ranging from public shaming to imprisonment and ultimately death. The young king personally examined every case, frequently increasing penalties if he felt the original sentences lacked sufficient fervor for Protestant purity. Harry VIII essentially created what one might call thought police, urging people to denounce neighbors' religious behavior with incentives for successful accusations. The king found personal satisfaction in reading these reports and often called the accusers to court to extract further information about those they implicated. Those accused of Catholic sympathies faced imprisonment, torture, or execution, as the young king personally examined and often intensified the suggested penalties. Eddie VI's court transformed into an environment where fear and fanaticism were encouraged, and compassion was viewed as a flaw. The system of persecution he established was notable for its thoroughness and his direct participation. Unlike adult monarchs who might hand such responsibilities to aides, Eddie VI demanded to assess every case himself, meticulously examining the accusations against each individual and frequently designing unique punishments based on his perception of their specific theological mistakes. His journals from this era resemble guides for faith-based oppression, containing in-depth consideration of the most effective penalties for various heresies. What makes Eddie VI's actions especially disturbing is the mixture of youthful inventiveness with deadly seriousness. When conventional punishments failed, this adolescent ruler concocted new methods of shame and agony, always justified by complex religious reasoning. One Catholic priest who would not abandon his beliefs was compelled to parade through London streets with a placard declaring, "Enemy of Christ," while children hurled stones at him, all under Eddie VI's direct orders. The king observed this scene from the window of his palace, reportedly laughing as the priest endured suffering while he dictated notes to his secretary. His fixation on religious purity reached deep into his own family, exposing a complete absence of natural warmth. Eddie VI saw his half-sister Mary, a devoted Catholic, not as kin but as the biggest threat to his Protestant England. In private correspondence that survived, Eddie expressed a hatred that combined childishness with coldness, calling her the illegitimate child and an enemy of Christ, while scheming how to declare her illegitimate or even have her executed for heresy. The boy who should have felt brotherly love instead nurtured dark fantasies of watching his sister be burned alive for her faith. Eddie's animosity toward Mary went far beyond politics. It seemed to consume him with a personal fury that unsettled even his most extreme advisors. The young monarch spent countless hours imagining ways to lawfully remove Mary from the line of succession, consulting with Protestant legal experts eager to justify what was essentially fratricide. Observers at court noticed that Eddie's mood would sour whenever Mary's name came up, and he often withdrew to his chambers to compose lengthy writings on the theological imperative of excluding her from the succession. The plans of this young sovereign were intense and unyielding. Handling Mary became increasingly intricate and harsh as Eddie VI created precise plans for her capture, trial, and execution, including exact accusations of heresy and treason. He even composed what was meant to be Mary's confession, compelling her to reject Catholicism and admit to being born outside wedlock before receiving the mercy of a swift death by beheading rather than burning. These papers, preserved in the royal archives, expose a mindset that had shifted far beyond ordinary political rivalry into genuine sociopathic loathing. Eddie VI's approach to Elizabeth was more complicated but just as unsettling. Although he approved of her Protestant faith, he mainly saw his younger sister as a tool to advance his religious goals rather than as family. Eddie planned to use Elizabeth's eventual marriage to solidify Protestant alliances, ignoring her personal happiness in favor of the political benefits her union could offer his cause. Even his relatively favorable feelings toward Elizabeth were shaped by his religious fanaticism, which made it clear that her worth to him was solely practical. The king's failure to build normal family bonds extended to his wider court. Eddie VI viewed his nobles, advisors, and servants not as individuals with their own value, but as mere pawns on a chessboard to be maneuvered according to his religious and political aims. Those who had served him loyally for many years could suddenly become expendable according to his shifting strategies. Supporters risked being cast aside or even put to death if they failed to display enough zeal for his progressively radical policies. Loyalty to Eddie VI demanded absolute obedience to his vision of a Protestant England, with no allowance for personal beliefs or ethical doubts. When Eddie VI started showing serious signs of illness in early 1553, his actions grew even more unpredictable and harsh. Instead of becoming gentler in light of his mortality, the 15-year-old monarch became fixated on making sure his Protestant changes would outlive him. He understood that if Mary came to power, Catholicism would be restored, and this fear drove him to increasingly desperate actions. The thought of his life's mission being undone by his Catholic sister filled Eddie with a fury almost bordering on madness, pushing him to consider solutions that would have shocked even his ruthless father. The young king's worsening health only seemed to fuel his extremism instead of calming it. As Eddie's body weakened, his religious zeal flared more intensely, as if he were trying to cram a lifetime of Protestant reform into the few months he had left. The royal doctors noted that his sickness included episodes where he preached feverishly, delivering confused sermons demanding the removal of all Catholic influence, even if it required killing every Catholic in England. At first, these tirades were seen as signs of delirium, but during moments of mental clarity, Eddie's intentions were chillingly clear. It became clear that his extreme remarks reflected sincere intentions rather than delirium caused by illness. Edward began secretly meeting with Protestant radicals who were plotting a coup designed to bypass both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of his Protestant relative, Lady Jane Grey. The conspiracy that unfolded was astonishing in its boldness and brutality, featuring schemes to capture or kill both of his sisters and establish a puppet government controlled by Protestant zealots. The 15-year-old king, despite his frail condition, threw himself into these plans with a vigor that both impressed and terrified his fellow conspirators. The specifics of Eddie VI's last scheme exposed the full depth of his change from an innocent youth to a would-be despot. Collaborating with John Dudley, the Duke of Northland, Edward devised a plot that would have led to the deaths of both his sisters and the creation of a Protestant regime far more radical than anything England had previously experienced. This plot included orders for mass executions of Catholic aristocrats, confiscation of all Catholic estates, and the establishment of a permanent religious police force tasked with overseeing every part of English life. Edward's own detailed and eager participation in planning these horrors was striking. During his final weeks, the dying king devoted himself to compiling lists of Catholics to be eliminated, estates to be taken, and laws to be implemented in his envisioned Protestant utopia, with his handwriting growing progressively more frantic. Unsteady because of his illness, he filled countless pages with schemes that amounted to religious extermination. The boy who had once appeared as a helpless pawn in political struggles revealed himself as the main architect behind a plot that would make the Spanish Inquisition seem tender in comparison. Yet Harry VIII's ailment took a cruel turn, almost like some divine punishment for his heinous plans. Modern medical research indicates that the young monarch suffered from a mix of tuberculosis and probably arsenic poisoning, likely given by his own doctors in a misguided effort to heal him. The bitter irony was not lost on those around him. The ruler who had spread religious hatred throughout England was himself being slowly poisoned by those trying to preserve his life. As the toxins gradually destroyed his body, Eddie VI endured hallucinations and bouts of madness seen by his attendants as divine revelations. The boy who showed no mercy to others spent his last days in torment, his body racked with unbearable pain as he gradually faded away. The royal physicians noticed that instead of offering spiritual relief, Edward Simmons's suffering deepened his religious obsession, as if the agony in his body intensified the fervor in his mind rather than cleansing it. The way Eddie VI died was especially dreadful for those who watched it happen. Court doctors documented that the young king's body started to emit a strange odor just before he passed. Several weeks before his passing, an awful stench began to emanate from him, and his skin took on a greenish hue, indicating severe poisoning. Eddie VI's hair and fingernails started to fall out, and he endured intense seizures that left him temporarily paralyzed. The boy who had once been regarded as one of the most handsome children of Harry VIII became a disturbing shadow of his former self, his body seemingly fighting against the poison gradually destroying him. Perhaps most unsettling was that the king remained clear-headed enough to grasp the situation, spending his final days alternating between screams of intense pain and frenzied speeches about Protestant martyrs. His last coherent statements did not focus on forgiveness or reunion, but on lamenting that he would not live to finish his intended purification of England. The dying monarch pleaded with his plotters to move forward with their plans even without his presence, assuring them that God would reward their loyalty in creating his envisioned Protestant paradise. The young ruler's final moments turned into a grim mockery of a deathbed scene. Instead of asking for mercy or showing love for his family, Eddie VI used his last breath to curse his Catholic sister Mary and implore God to protect Protestant England from what he called her wickedness. Witnesses shared that his closing words were filled with hatred, a fitting close to a life dominated by religious zeal and political extremism. When Eddie VI finally passed away on that day, it marked the end of a turbulent era. On the 6th of July, in the year 1553, the relief among the king's followers was almost tangible, though few dared to admit it openly. The young monarch, who was expected to be England's savior, turned into its nightmare and his own undoing. His death provided the sole release from the harsh policies that had pushed the country to the edge of civil war. Even his fiercest backers privately conceded that Eddie VI's passing might have been a kindness to England, though none would voice these feelings publicly. The immediate consequences of Eddie VI's death exposed how utterly his elaborate schemes depended on his personal authority. Once the monarch's strong will disappeared, the conspiracy quickly unraveled as moderate Protestants rejected what they now saw as a radical plot. Lady Jane Grey, who was supposed to inherit the throne, found herself almost deserted as nobles who had appeared devoted to the Protestant cause suddenly claimed pressing matters elsewhere. Mary's successful claim was backed not only by Catholics, but also by moderate Protestants appalled by what Eddie VI's rule had revealed about the dangers of religious fanaticism. The boy king who dreamed of becoming England's greatest Protestant hero ended up leaving a legacy marked mainly by brutality and the widespread relief that accompanied his death even among his most loyal followers. Protestants unexpectedly found themselves accepting Catholic Mary as a better option compared to the ongoing control by Protestant zealots. The irony surrounding Harry VIII's successor, extends well beyond the unsuccessful plans for succession. The young monarch, who was deeply obsessed with eradicating Catholic influence, ironically ended up reinforcing it through his own radical actions. His harsh treatment of moderate Protestants left English Protestantism ruled by extremists who alienated regular followers instead of drawing them in. By the time he passed away, many English Protestants began to see Catholicism as a shelter from the severe demands imposed by Eddie VI's version of a Reformed faith. Contemporary historians have started to reassess Eddie VI's rule, and the new perspective is much bleaker than the familiar tale of a frail boy controlled by ambitious courtiers. Court documents and private letters reveal a young man who took genuine pleasure in persecution and displayed troubling enjoyment in others' suffering. Eddie VI was personally involved in organizing executions and maintained detailed records of torture techniques. This evidence suggests that England was governed for 6 years by what can only be described as a child with psychopathic tendencies wielding absolute authority. The transformation of Eddie VI from a naive youth into a merciless despot offers chilling insights into how absolute power can deeply corrupt an individual, unlike rulers who had grown into adulthood. Harry VIII's son might have maintained at least some ability for compassion or political strategy. However, Eddie VI's total detachment from ordinary human connections and his absolute conviction in his divine right formed a perfect storm of cruelty. This boy, who had never heard the word no and who saw any resistance to his wishes as sinful, became capable of acts so brutal they shocked even the harsh Tudor era. Historical records indicate that Eddie VI's courtiers grew increasingly alarmed by his conduct, but felt powerless to control him. The same belief in divine authority that validated his rule also rendered any challenge to his decisions as blasphemous, leaving his closest advisors helpless to temper his extreme actions. The young monarch created a regime where his slightest desire instantly became law, and his escalating appetite for harshness faced no barrier except death itself. Perhaps the most disturbing question is what might have unfolded if Eddie VI had reached adulthood. His vision for Protestant England included forming a permanent religious police, eradicating the Catholic aristocracy entirely, and establishing a surveillance state to oversee every detail of his subjects' private affairs. Although the teenager who passed away in 1553 had only implemented parts of these plans, there is every indication that an adult Eddie VI would have fully realized such a system. Among history's most oppressive rulers, the legacy of Eddie VI reminds us that evil can arise from unexpected places and that even noble intentions may be twisted by unchecked authority and religious extremism. The young sovereign, certain he was preserving England's spirit, nearly annihilated its very existence. His passing might have been the greatest kindness his leadership could grant his people. His tale warns us about the peril of merging absolute power with unwavering ideology, especially when wielded by someone too immature to grasp the full impact of their deeds. Eddie's journey also exposes the treacherous crossroads of youth, authority, and dogma. While grown despots may show restraint through political pragmatism or personal ties, Eddie's utter solitude combined with his steadfast conviction in his righteousness rendered him capable of envisioning horrors that seasoned politicians found appalling. The child who should have been engrossed in play was instead orchestrating mass killings and religious cleansings. treating human life as something disposable in his pursuit of spiritual purity. His era reveals how education can transform into brainwashing if deprived of balance and empathy. Eddie's mentors shaped a remarkable theological mind, yet also a moral fiend, one who could invent complex intellectual excuses for cruelty, yet lacked the compassion to prevent it. Harry VIII never developed fundamental human compassion, and his story stands as a stark warning about the risks involved when an educational system values ideological rigidity more than basic kindness. Ultimately, Eddie VI's short time on the throne remains one of the most unsettling examples of power destroying innocence. The boy once adored as Harry VIII's favored successor ended up a figure so terrifying that his own passing was greeted with relief by his people. His journey from a guarded child to a potential despot uncovers unsettling realities about human behavior and the unique threats posed by those convinced that their harshness serves a greater cause. The death of Eddie VI symbolized not only the conclusion of a young life, but also the collapse of what might have been England's bleakest future. The young monarch's final moments, filled with suffering and a burning resentment toward his own kin, provide a grim closure to a reign that had initially held much promise, yet yielded only dread. By dying prematurely, Eddie VI may have unknowingly delivered his greatest gift to England, the very nation he professed to cherish, sparing it from the full realization of his dreadful ambitions.